Hello everyone, today we talk about the cost of ancient and medieval naval warfare, modeling it around essentially the heyday of Athenian thalassocracy that is relatively well documented and for this purpose, and trying to make a comparison. I will probably lose a lot of economists within my subscribers because of this, with today's modern costs based on some US economic standards, chiefly, average wage and U.S. Navy costs. The Athenian thalassocracy in here is, economically at least maybe, and because the calculation I made actually is somewhat corresponding to the current American one, not politically, not militarily, not socially, okay, with all this, in fact, enormous differences, but still, speaking of probably just of costs, and that's what struck me fundamentally. And literally, it's very difficult to relate the cost of things in ancient times to modern values, right? But we have, some information available about the various costs and wages for shipbuilding and manning the ships, paying the crews essentially. So we can make some broader consideration. It will be convenient to express all costs in drachmae, and the conversion table for Athenian money is 6 obols 1 drachma, 100 drachmae 1 mina, and 60 minae 1 talent, right? And consider that 1 drachma was considered at the time the average wage for 1 day of work, right, out there, and the rowers were paid effectively 1 drachma a day. So that gives you the equation. What was triggered there from the Persian Wars onward is the expansion of the Athenian navy. So the inclusion also in policy of the lower classes. So it's not these were not slaves. Slavery among rowers is not really an ancient nor a medieval thing, right? It's mostly in the early modern age because of the Christian-Ottoman struggle. This was a normal job, right, with a normal salary. However, 1 drachma was not really possible to be paid all the time. For example, after the disastrous Sicilian expedition, that was halved, and in fact, half a drachma was more likely the standard of such pay, because otherwise it would have been really unsustainable by the state, broadly meant. There were, as we'll see, there were some offices, even some subcontracting for the way the navy was paid. The pays were somewhat also not necessarily that regular as we think, or I don't know, if the sailors were stationed in the Piraeus, they would be paid more. So these are all details, but today we're trying to make it simple. There were lots of expenses, as we'll see now, for not just building and paying building the ships and paying the crews, but also for upkeeping, and especially in war, things are going to get crashed dramatically easily if nature doesn't think about that with storms, etc. In any case, at the time of the Peloponnesian War, the daily rate of pay, we can fix it to half drachma, right? So 3 obols. The cost of the triarchy, that was a tax on the very wealthy liturgy, as it was called at the time, that would present with this office, so to contribute to the navy costs. In other words, the cost of the triarch of keeping 1 trireme in good order for 1 year was 40 to 60 minae, so equating 4,000 to 6,000 drachmae. Right. While at the time of the Persian Wars, before, the cost of a new trireme had been 1 talent, that is 6,000 drachmae. So, as you understand, here there is an equation between shipbuilding and maintaining for 1 year, right? However, there was some degree of inflation between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian one times. So the cost of 1 talent probably did not include during the Persian Wars, for example, the cost of fitting out the ship or equipping it. And of course, all these things could vary in time. It was not a complete homogeneity, but we can see some, some standards at least. So the cost of one new trireme, that was the standard warship at the time of the Peloponnesian War, has been can be estimated at 2 talents altogether. So 12,000 drachmae, both for the shipping and the fitting, more specifically. While the upkeeping would be something like between 1/3 and half of such figure, right? For example, we know that a trireme needed to carry half of spare oars to allow for breakage during the season, and oars naturally were quite important for the speed, for maneuvering and so on. But it's probable that the other costs to fit the ship were in proportion, right? So somewhat half of it, or maybe slightly less, right? As we may expect from a lightly built galley, after all, on war service. The crew's pays were actually provided by the state, not the trierarch. So this, the crew, the trireme crew, was around 200, let's say. So this would make the cost wages for monthly something like 3,000 drachmae, right? And given that troops were commissioned for usually 8 months during the good season, this in the Mediterranean, this would make 24,000 drachmae, right, in total for 1 year. That is to say, essentially twice the cost of a new trireme, and 4 to 6 times the cost of a trierarch. So in this, we also have to cross out probably the food cost, because this was meant to be bought privately by the crews that, as you know, needed to rest, to stop at a port basically every day. This was all naturally coastal navigation, and they had to be well rested, well fed, and seemingly the state did not. There is a debate. This is debatable, let's say, but at least in the cost, let's take it out just to presume that this that there were not additional costs, let's say, to gradually make by the state, assuming a bit all the wall supplying issue, which in such a degree of centralized system, however, is somewhat likely by a certain standard. Essentially an admiral had to base his fleet near to a convenient market on the coast, and yes, I mean, in the Aegean, in other seas frequented by the Greeks, that this would be fairly easy, but naturally not all strategic conditions could make you afford that. In any case, the crews were meant to buy food with their own money. It's a bit like the Roman army. That the idea that still the equipment, even in imperial times, was in theory still to be literally both within the same statile administration that provided it by the legionary, eventually had to return it. The same goes for the food and so on. But we know that practically these things at least were organized at the central level. And maybe, yes, there was this subtraction, this compensation, like the subtracting from the pays. In any case, let's cross that out for the sake of simplicity. Now, the Athenian fleet, as we've seen, was something around 300 triremes in the heyday. Then during the 4th century, there wasn't actually a qualitative decline. It's just Athenian power altogether shrunk compared to others, where the Athenian navy was crushed by the Macedonian one. By that time, Athens had added substantially. It had actually originally expanded the number of triremes, eventually contracted in favor of the building of quadriremes that were something like out of 40 at that point. So there was an increase in quality and in size of the ships. And in fact, for Hellenistic times, we think that on average, of course, there were bigger ships than classical ones with bigger crews. It's just we are worse documented, because classical Greece was much more, participated politically and militarily speaking by the same historiographers, differently from Hellenistic times. So paradoxically, and also about Roman time, we know less than classical Greece at some levels. So in any case, we think that the pay of the crew will have formed an even greater proportion of the Hellenistic fleet's costs. So, in a very approximate sense, considering the properly shipbuilding, the fitting and the upkeeping and the crew space, we can say that the total cost of an ancient fleet was something like 25% higher than the cost of the crew's pay, right? Per se altogether. And we know that there was naturally some speculation about this. It was a business. The Rhodians, that were a very commercially minded people, at later times, in Hellenistic times, chartered out some triremes at 10,000 drachmae per month, right? And so it's very few, and probably costs and wages would have been somewhat double the one of Peloponnesian War time. So they would have included something like 6,000 drachmae wages and 1,500 drachmae for the ships and their upkeep. This would leave like 1/3 of sheer profit, right? And that would be the speculation. As we're saying Roman times, we think that the fleets were probably costed the same way, the same standards of Hellenistic times. After all, not much had changed. So something twice the Peloponnesian figure we're giving before. And a Roman imperial marine received something around 100 denarii, which was something around 330 drachmae, which fits the equivalence. In more modern times, there was a more scientific calculation for considering the cost of building a wooden ship that essentially reflected the formula cost per ton equals 1 day's pace for shipwright times 120. Right, so an ancient trireme would have been something like 50 tons, right? And a shipwright's pay, as we've seen, one drachma as the average wage labor, and this would gives us, if we were to use the 120 thing, is 50 per 120, so it makes 6,000 drachmae, right? Which equals the recorded figure of 1 talent, which, as we were saying before, is too low. And in this sense, we have to consider that, especially since the second modern age, the mortise and tenon would make shipbuilding much, much cheaper, right? In other words, labor force and materials were later times were given the economic sector would be easier and cheaper to find, right? And thus, in ancient times, it was really difficult thing to find. So think about just the economic growth rate. Essentially, what you produced, you paid, right? So even to make such kind of speculation, as we have seen in the Rhodian example, was like an exception, right? And in realities where surely, there was a lot of wealth, but this still has to be reconnected to real economy at the time. So in ancient times, yes, it was more complicated to build a ship and more costly properly to make all the material and labor force and the skills arrive where and another. So the figure of 120 for modern times should probably be adjusted upwards, right? And this fits what we know, generally speaking, about ancient technology and economy. And this gradual change in time can be seen already, for example, in Byzantine times, where the building cost of a ship was about 45 solidi per ton, right? Which is something like a laborer's wage for a year, right? So taking a shipwright earning twice a laborer's wage, this gives a multiplier for the formula of 180 for Byzantine times, right? Where the mortise and tenon constructions were already kind of modified, simplified, mediated, and so on. So if we, that formula can be adjusted to something like 200, 220, right, for classical times, which would give, confirmation of the cost of the trireme already arrived at. So corresponding to what we were saying. So one may make a very bold equation with today's American costs, right? Considering $142 a day, like that, as that drachma that we based our calculation on, the construction of a ship would cost something $1,700,000, right? And the cruise pays for 8 months would be something like $3 million and $400,000 altogether. And the Athenian navy of 300 triremes, right, the heyday of the Italocracy, etc., would require $1,022,000,000, right, a year, effectively, which is considering the budget of the U.S. Navy today is $163 billion, naturally very very small. However, we have to consider the following. First of all, this is actually based on just half drachma, so to double it would be naturally $2 billion. But we have to consider also the growth rate, right? Before the pandemic, now the U.S. GDP increased something like 2 point something percent a year, right? In pre-industrial times, like the crop rate growth was ridiculous, right? In medieval times, a peasant could work for a lifetime, let's say 50 years of work, which is, yeah, probably for earning essentially only 4% more than his previous wealth. So basically not even realizing that this would make a growth rate 25% higher today than one of medieval times. So if in this sense we adjust the wages accordingly, we would have something between $25 billion to $50 billion to pay the whole Athenian crew. And considering that the $163 billion for the U.S. Navy do not account for exclusively for the salaries, right? As I've seen, I don't have at the moment figures exactly for the Navy, which I presume in general I'm not particularly convinced of, has, say, more expenses in things other than pay itself compared to other forces. But given that the U.S. armed forces altogether pay something like 1/4 of their budget for salaries, then we have applied to the Navy, that would be something like $40 billion. So something that perfectly fits in between the $25 to $50 billion for the Athenian Navy. So this is an interesting coincidence because there are actually other factors that would be to be considered. But considering a major power that extends, also had a dramatic maritime strategic projection. As you know, basically the U.S. are the only country in the world that can literally fight in every place of the globe, right? Here, I consider the U.S. Navy, Marines are something else, but those are the guys that can't do that, right? The Athenians were so at in land armies. The U.S. in here are something a bit different, but in terms properly of maritime investment, right? There can be this nice analogy that, after all, considering the growth rate of our civilizations and seeing how much was spent for the Navy, in proportion that the absolute cost doesn't seem to be much different given the respective, the relative cost, but still based in absolute terms, aside from the relative things that different make the difference in proportion in the world between today's U.S. armed force, U.S. Navy, and the Athenian Navy of the 5th century BC. It's they are surprisingly similar, quantitatively speaking. So that's interesting. I hope the calculation makes somewhat sense. And for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.